guys, Miss Osuna here. Today we're going to do lots of good stuff together. We're going to render lace. As you see, the sleeve is lace. We're going to do gathers at the neckline, and we are going to do stretch denim. That's our skirt. We're going to do jewelry, the earrings and the bracelet. And then of course we're going to do the face and the hair and the touch of fingernails. So we have lots of good details for today's sketch. Let's get into it. So the shoulder guideline is lower on the left, and then the waist guideline is higher on the left. Go on ahead and measure from 0 to 1.5. That's the width of your shoulder. 1.5 head spaces wide. Make sure you drop down below that guideline for the shoulder slope, just slightly below, probably even only 1/8 of an inch on your sketch. Then I added in the collarbone and the neck detail. Now we're going to go on ahead and put in our bust guideline. It's parallel to the shoulder. You have a smile for that bust and bring it up to the shoulder itself. And now on the right side, you have another bust, of course, and then your rib cage down to the waist. Now we are going to do our hip section. So I've made the hips, in this case, wider slightly than the shoulder. But the standard measurement would be 1.5 head spaces wide for the hip and shoulder. So I've chosen to make mine wider for my target market. But of course, do what is best for you and your target market. Now we have a letter N for the top of our arm. And then we want to measure from 1.5 down to 3. And that's where we know we'll put in our guideline for the elbow. And then measure from 3 to 4.25. Then that's where we know we will put our socket guideline for the wrist. Now take those long parentheses, drag it down, and that gives you your arm. Those are nothing more than long parentheses. Now this is our hand, and our thumb is on the left side, fingertip is on the right. So we now are putting in our fingers with straight lines and then a letter J to flesh it out on the bottom edge. And in here we have our thumb, like I said, closest to the body on the left side. So this wrist has a very nice twist. All these little details, bending the elbow, waist guideline, different than the shoulder guideline. This all gives nice movement. The neck with the both parentheses facing right. This is just a lot of good movement. Subtle details, but they matter. Next, let's go on ahead and find our 4.25 mark. That's where we put in our bikini bottoms. Our next bit of information is finding the center of the leg on the left and drag that down to number 6, and that goes toward the center line. That's the knee at 6. We know Horny Alex was caught French kissing Carrie Ann's grandmother. Then from 6 down to 8, that is going to be your knee to ankle, and then 8 to 9 is your foot. So drag out those long parentheses for the thigh. Again, make whatever size croquis works for your target market. I'm going to do a thinner croquis here, but that's not always the case. So just make sure that you make whatever you need for your target market. As we move to the next leg, you always start at the center of our leg opening, and it's going to hide behind our first leg. And then at the ankle, we're going to draw the foot turned over toward the right side of the sketch. Like I said, we are drawing the second leg slightly hidden behind the first leg, and it's the same parenthesis shapes that we use for our legs, and then our diagonal lines with our smile for the foot. Now we're going to move on and draw our guideline for our arm on the left side of our sketch. So literally I start with that guideline, and then we go to our center vertical and measure from 1.5 to 3. That's shoulder to elbow. Put in your elbow socket there. And of course, drag those parentheses down for your arm. Then 3 to 4.25. That's elbow to wrist. Go on and drag down the second parenthesis for the forearm. Now we have another hand, and it is turned at the wrist. And again, this just gives more interest to the croquis. Diagonal lines for the outside edges of our hand. And of course, flesh that out with the J shapes. All right, let's go on ahead and place the finger details in. Remember, those are straight lines that are diagonal. Then we have that J shape. So it's very easy to achieve. Straight line and then your J shape from the fingertip upward. That's for the fingertip at the very edge of our finger. Now we're gonna move on. What I'm gonna do is just take black ink in a fine point and just trace it so that way I can put my marker paper on top and see through. You can do this for the croquis that you really like. This way you can use these croquis with marker paper on top and actually see the details and just draw right there very lightly. The idea here is that you're not drawing from scratch onto your marker paper. So now I'm going to speed this up. As you can see, it's already going faster. We are going to grab marker paper and put right on top. I literally like to use a mechanical pencil that has a hard lid so that it's not soft and easy to smudge. And I'm just tracing right through. Now follow along as we draw the clothing details onto our croquis. Once again, this is very lightly drawn because we want that marker to stand out. So we have a wavy line at the neckline because we're going to have gathers. So go on ahead then and put your parenthesis shapes. They go in the center and then they go toward the left and toward the right. Those are your gather lines. The next bit of information, we are going to communicate our sleeve. So this particular sleeve is a set-in sleeve. So it starts with a little frown above the shoulder slightly. So there's our armhole and then there's that frown just barely above the shoulder. And then go on ahead and draw in your shoulder seam slightly above the croquis body. And then you'll be able to put your sleeve underarm seam in place. Okay, so you can see we have gathers at the wrist as well. There's a little bit of a bell shape and more gather lines there. So notice that the details are extremely important here for the gather lines to come in, the bell shape at the bottom of the sleeve, and then that little frown above the shoulder. These are just tiny little details, but it adds up to communicate exactly what you want for the feeling of the garment. It's a set-in sleeve. There's gathers at the wrist, not at the shoulder. And then I'm just tracing down the body. It's going to be stretched denim for the skirt portion of this. So our top is going to be much more fancy with a lace and some beading, but the bottom from the waist down is going to be stretch denim. So erase the center of your croquis where the body actually is. Go on ahead and clean that up. And I like to use a dry watercolor brush just to get rid of all the erasings. You can blow your paper, but sometimes it'll get wet. You can also use your hand, but sometimes you might smear. So I use the dry watercolor brush, and I use both the kneaded eraser because I feel like that gives me a nice, very light, soft erasing. And then if I want a harder eraser, I will use a harder one as well. Next, we're drawing in a cutout, and that is at the bust. So I have a smile shape from the shoulder over toward the left, and then a frown shape is on top. So that's the cutout for our bust area. And then we have the left side of our shirt being higher, so it's asymmetrical. The right side of our shirt is lower. So after you erase the lines that you don't need, you are going to go on ahead and get started with your marker. So I'm doing the skin tone. This is Sand, the color. And I'm starting on the outer edge of the sleeve. So that upper left edge of the sleeve is where I'm starting, and the left edge of the hand. My shadow side is the left side. And of course, you can do it the opposite way where your shadow side is the right side too. But whatever you do, just be consistent, because that way you can move quickly when you're at work and create a beautiful croquis every time. So I'm going to go down the shadow side here on the left side with this very light sand color, and then I'm going to add a little bit on the right side as well. So the outer edges are where I'm focusing because this is lace for our sleeve. So the nice thing about lace is that if you make the outer edges darker, that will allow the lace to show up even more so and appear more realistic. So go on ahead, follow along. I'm just going to add in more skin tone on the hands, on the neck, on the face, so that I can make sure that we do have a feeling of transparency on those sleeves, and then the neck will be darker. So this is my first skin tone. Once again, my color is Sand, but just make sure that you use colors that blend well for whatever skin tones you personally want. So now here I'm on the shadow side of the face. Notice that I'm going in a curved motion, like a parenthesis. And now I'm going to go back in on that shadow side. So when you add more color on top of the original color, of course, it's going to appear darker. And as that appears darker on the shadow side, obviously the lighter side, where our light source is, appears lighter. So here you can see I'm darkening that shadow side all the way down the shoulder, the wrist, and even though on the right side of the sketch, I definitely want to emphasize the left side of the hand being darker, and I want to emphasize the left side of the forearm being darker. So keep that in mind. Your shadow side should appear darker all the way across all parts of the sketch. Next, I'm moving on to my second color. In my case, I'm using Putty, P-U-T-T-Y, and again, my markers are not even in the same family made by the same company. Just as long as they blend well together is all you really need. It's not so much the actual marker as it is, in this case, the technique. So I've added that shadow. Now I'm going back in with my first color, and before it dries, I'm just softening and blending, especially on the light side. So I'm blending that transition. So here down the neck on the left side, I'm starting to fill that in with my putty. And before it dries, I'm switching back to my sand to blend that in, especially where there's the transition. I'm just going to go on ahead and go back and forth between my first color and second color as I slightly darken. And before it dries, I go back and forth to soften it with my lighter color. Now we are done with that portion of our sketch. It's time to put in a few floral details. You don't have to do tons, and they don't have to be super specific, unless of course you want to render a specific lace. So I'm putting in some floral shapes. They look almost like clouds, and then I'll put in some leaves, and I'll connect with swirling lines so that we have a feeling of consistency. So this is, once again, my mechanical pencil, and it has a hard lead so that it's not going to smear. Sometimes I like to draw with the soft lead when I do want to have smudges, but this is not that case. Once I add in these swirling lines to connect each flower together, it starts to feel like a continual lace pattern. Next, we simply put diagonal lines behind the floral shapes. So most of these diagonal lines are going to be in a grid pattern, and that gives that mesh feeling. So once you've finished your floral pattern and everything has a swirling line to connect from flower to flower, go on ahead and start to do a grid, diagonal lines, so that you can have a mesh feeling, because lace has a very obvious grid and a mesh feeling to it, and you can see it. That's what makes it so beautiful. So drawing in those diagonal lines, and then we'll move on. Make sure that you go both directions so that you make a grid. Okay, so next I'm going to move over to my fine point black ink, and I'm going to start to fill in these grid lines. Remember, this grid pattern does not cross on top of our flowers. They are only behind the flowers. Now, sometimes I know students can get stuck in trying to spend too much time rendering. Remember, your job as a fashion designer is to create an idea, and a fashion sketch is an abbreviated art form. So if you just did a quick Google search and typed in fashion sketch with florals, you will see there's not a whole lot of detail placed in general. Of course, there are some exceptions, but there's not a whole lot of detail placed on each flower, each leaf, every single detail, all the veins of the flowers, etc. Because the idea is to focus your energy mostly on the garment itself, and you're just giving a hint of what the fabric is like. So don't stress yourself too much trying to figure a really difficult floral shape. All you really need is a very basic cloud shape and a couple of leaf shapes, and that is enough to communicate to the eye for this particular type of an art form. Fashion sketching is not the type of art that you want to see in a gallery that has every detail rendered looking exactly like the real life version of that detail. That's not the case here. You're giving an impression of what the fabric is, but your focus as a designer is really to communicate what this garment is like and to make people excited to buy it. So this is an abbreviated art form. It's an art form all of its own, and it is not intended to be the type of an art form where the work is 100% realistic, because the work is intended to get you excited to purchase the garment and to communicate what the garment is like. I'm just gonna go back in with a piece of paper under my hand. Sometimes I do that so that I don't smudge the artwork. And then I will start to pull out the shapes of our floral. Again, these are cloud shapes, very simple, and you can do this relatively quickly. And I highly encourage you to do a research. Just any search engine, type in fashion sketching with florals, and you'll see the looseness of the floral detail in most cases. Now, of course, if you needed to have an exact type of floral, you can also do that, but that's not the standard for the art form. Now with a fine point side of my gray marker, this is a dark gray, I'm just going to go on the insides of these floral shapes to create shadow. So that's on the inside, just like a cloud, and I'm creating some shadow. Next, I'm going to do the outer edges of the sleeve with black colored pencil, but notice I'm pressing very lightly. And next, with that dark gray on the fine tip side, the fine point, I'm adding the top of our gathers at that neckline. So that's a wavy line at the neckline. And then I'm just going to put in those parenthesis shapes for the gathers. They are very uneven on purpose. And then I'm just going to soften the armhole and our hem where we have gathers at the wrist. So this dark gray is helpful in creating some depth. Ultimately, this is going to end up a black lace sleeve, and the rest of our top is also going to ultimately end up being black. So I'm starting with the dark gray instead of starting with the black so that I can add to the depth as I go along. Next, I'm moving to the actual black marker. And I'm going to go on ahead and define these outer edges. I placed a Z shape at the elbow bend, and I will also give a little bit of a pull line so that you can see where the fabric moves on the left side as well. It looks sort of like a lightning bolt. Okay, now I'm going to move on to my light shade, which for us is that dark gray. So I'm back to that lighter shade, and I'm starting to add from the black, notice, at the edges, and I'm darkening the entire sketch. Always starting though, notice, on the shadow side, which for me is the left side. So even though I'm on the right side of the sketch, the left side of the arm should feel darker than the right side. Just imagine a big light on the right side, so it's easier for you to imagine where the shadow goes. Same thing for the sleeve on the left side of our sketch. I am adding this gray just to darken from the black. Notice it gets wet when you go over it, and then you can pull it up and outward, so that of course you can start to create a graded shadow. Now I'm simply going to move to black colored pencil, and I will start to lightly fill that shadow in. Remember, the black colored pencil is darker than the black marker. So in this case, I'm going slightly on top of the flowers. The only thing that was behind the flowers was that grid, and that is the mesh background to form our lace. Now I have black fine point pen, and I'm just going to start to add some dots all over. Once I finish putting dots all over and darkening the grid, those diagonal lines, then I'm going to go through some of the floral shapes and just pull some of those out. Next, we are going to move on to white colored pencil. And on the light side of our sketch, I'm just going to simply add some highlight. So notice that's the right side of both arms. Mostly this is going on the right side. And then I'm going to add on top of that colored pencil some of my white gel pen. And then this is once again just to add to the highlight on the light side of both arms. If your gel pencil doesn't go easily on top of your colored pencil, you can just dab and scribble at it, and then it'll start working again. Now I'm just adding some dots with the acrylic gel pen as well as the highlights. Mostly everything is staying though on the light side. Now let's fill in the upper yoke of our shirt. So I have my brush tip for my gray marker. Once again, this is a dark gray. And I am just filling in, starting mostly on that shadow side. We have some gathers, and then I am defining the bottom edge of the cutout. Next, we're going to move on to our black marker, and we are going to basically repeat the same step. I always add lighter first and then darker second as a standard way of functioning. That allows me to control how dark I want everything to be and to preserve the lights that I want to keep. So notice the right side of this upper yoke is white. I'm going to take away that white space little by little, but I still want to keep that feeling of light on the right side of our sketch. Now I'm just going over it so that that ink didn't dry yet. That black ink is still wet, and so here I am with my gray brush tip, that dark gray that I've been using. And I'm just dragging that black paint down to get that graded shadow effect. And now I'm repeating the process again, going back to the black marker. Starting on the shadow side, just repeating the same process until I get the depth that I'm after. Now we can start the lower half of our shirt. Now that our sleeve is done and our upper yoke is finished, the lower portion of the shirt is where we are going to start next. So I have my black marker and I'm just defining those edges, and I'm going to put gathers on that left side because we are gathering it over here. So there's a wavy edge at the left edge. It's not perfectly straight. And then remember, gathers go kind of like a sun, so there's a radial motion. So they are going in the center, they're straight, and on the bottom they curve downward, and then in the upper portion they curve upward. So follow that general pattern. Now I'm just going to switch to my lighter gray and take that black ink and drag it down. And as you drag it down, you're able to get the graded shadow effect that we were talking about. So I'm just going to bounce back and forth between the black and the gray in a similar manner that I did with the upper yoke. Next, we move to our black colored pencil, and we are going to continue adding the shadows. Remember, the black colored pencil is darker than the black marker. So we are just going to continue taking away some of that light until we have as much of it left as we want. Here we are now going to blend with our blender. So the colorless blender has a mixture in it that's an alcohol and glycerin base, and you can also get refill liquid for those blenders because you use them a lot. So I'm just going to pick up the ink that's on the page and start to blend it, like I said, to take away some of the light so I can leave as much as I want left behind. This is really a preference, however much you want to get rid of. But just keep in mind, you still do want to have the feeling of left side being darker, right side being lighter. That's it for part 1. Stick around for part 2. I'll see you on our next video. Until we meet again, happy sketching!